Hello everyone, welcome back to our overview of the circulatory system, specifically our overview of the heart. Now that we've gone through the general orientation and location of the heart, let's take a more in-depth look at the actual anatomy or the gross anatomy of the heart itself. So we're going to start out by looking at the superficial features of the heart, the superficial anatomy, and that all starts with a structure known as the pericardium. And so the heart is actually encased in a double membrane known as the pericardium. And there, like I said, was a double membrane. There are two layers. There is the parietal pericardium, which is also referred to as the pericardial sac, and this is simply a fibrous balloon or sac that encapsulates the heart. Okay, it's got an outer, very fibrous, very inelastic, very non-tearable. You can actually, in the cadaver, pull on this for days and it will not tear. Very similar to the dura mater in the brain. Okay? And then on the inside, there's a very thin serous membrane. The visceral pericardium is this thin, very clear, kind of glossy coating that you get on the surface of the heart itself. And it's important to point out that the pericardial sac comes up here, kind of involutes or invaginates on itself, and becomes the serous layer, or that visceral pericardial layer. So although they're technically two different layers, they are originating from one anatomical structure. Now, the reason why we have this pericardial sac is for two reasons. One is in that pericardial sac, or existing between those pericardial layers, you have a structure known as the pericardial cavity or the pericardial space. And in this space, you have a fluid. It's a serous, slightly more viscous than water fluid that basically lubricates the surface of the heart and prevents the heart, as it beats, from creating friction and actual burning alongside the heart from coming in contact with the lungs. And the second reason why we have the pericardial sac is to compartmentalize the heart. We're going to talk about later in the semester when we get to the lungs how the lungs are also compartmentalized in their own sac known as the pleura. But this is so that any infection or any trauma or any injury that is localized to one of these three regions doesn't necessarily spill over into one of the other regions. If you have a localized infection to the inferior lobe of the right lung, you wouldn't want it to be able to readily spread to the heart. I don't need to explain to you why that would be a bad thing, but again, just something for you to be aware of, that this structure does serve a very important protective anatomical function. Now that is the most superficial covering of the heart. But if we get into the actual layers of the heart wall itself, we have three primary layers that you need to be aware of. We have the epicardium, which is, as the name implies, the outermost layer. We have the myocardium, which is the thicker muscular middle layer of the heart. And then we have the endocardium, which is this clear sheen-like lining that we get on the internal chambers of the heart itself. Okay? Now, the myocardium is a really, really cool structure in and of itself. It's made up of multiple cardiomyocytes that are anchored to this fibrous skeleton of the heart. And that fibrous skeleton goes on to basically give the heart its overall structure, as well as allowing for the insulation of the electrochemical signals that get sent through the heart. And we'll talk more about the actual cardiovascular physiology in a later lecture series. Okay? But the cool thing about those myocardium, or those myocardial cells, the way they're oriented is in this really awesome kind of spiraling fashion that you can see right here, and they spiral up and around the heart. And what this does is this allows, if you remember how muscle cells are oriented, and I'll pull up a picture of cardiomyocytes here. If you remember how they're oriented in this sort of back-to-back fashion, so that when they contract, when those filaments slide past each other, you get this shrinking on multiple fronts. And so when you take a look at how that would work in this kind of spiral fashion, what happens to the heart when those muscles contract is you get this nice ringing, churning, three-dimensional squeezing motion that allows the heart to more effectively pump blood than if we had these fibers oriented on only one axis, either vertically or horizontally. So if we want to take just a general overview of the heart as it sits, the outermost layer of the encapsulating layers, and the encapsulating layers I'm going to circle right here in red, you have the parietal pericardium, which is that most superficial part of the sac, which is also known as the pericardial sac. Then you have the visceral pericardium next, which is lining the surface of the heart, as it lines the viscera. In between those, you have the pericardial cavity, or that pericardial space. But then, from superficial to deep, you have the epicardium, myocardium in the middle, and then endocardium lining the inside. And epi on top, endo being on the inside, and myo meaning muscle, cardium. It's the actual muscle of the heart itself. We're going to back up here and we're going to talk about the cardiomyocytes for just a minute. The cardiomyocytes are a very unique tissue in the grand scheme of all histology in the body. If you remember back to 201, we talked about striated muscle cells. Specifically, those are in skeletal muscle cells and also in the cardiac muscle tissue, as you can see here. Okay? These cardiomyocytes are uninucleate, but they are comprised of multiple myofibrils. So you can see in this cartoon image, we have one nucleus, but we have multiple myofibrils within that cellular unit. Okay? And basically, the way these cells are organized, they're organized into these little compartmentalized blocks. Okay? These single units, I'll go ahead and get rid of these single units that are stacked very closely next to one another. And joining these together on their ends are these little structures down here called intercalated discs. And these are complexes of fascia, adherens, and gap junctions that basically allow for not only a very tight adhesion of the cardiomyocytes to one another, but because there's these gap junctions, these little tiny pores that connect the cytosol from one cell to the next, ions are able to rapidly diffuse from one cardiomyocyte to another. And this is very important for the rapid and coordinated contraction of the cardiomyocytes. You want all the heart muscle cells to be able to contract not only in sequence, but almost at the exact same time as one another for a coordinated contraction. Because the moment those cells get out of sync, you wind up with a condition known as fibrillation, and that usually requires some sort of intervention if it gets serious enough and could potentially lead to death. Okay? So we want these nice anatomical structures, again, known as intercalated discs, that are very unique and are readily identifiable, so you're expected to know where they are in the cardiac histology. Again, layers of the heart, anatomically speaking. And that concludes our gross overview of the superficial features of the heart. We're going to take a further in-depth look at some more features here in just a few minutes. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you here soon.